This morning you are talking about housing. If you become Chancellor, will you spend taxpayers' money on building houses?
This isn't about spending taxpayers' money. This is about unblocking the planning system. It's about offering some form.
There you go. Council housing is completely off the agenda now as far as Rachel Reeves is concerned. Will you use state money on building new social housing? No, in fact. We will deregulate the planning industry and allow the private sector to be able to run rampant and pave over the entire country. Exactly what we wanted. Which of course will not solve the problem, because they'll just get sold to speculators or they'll build luxury flats, and the rules on what's affordable are clearly not good enough to be able to actually develop proper affordable housing. All of these people are saying, well, we have to be able to build council housing to deal with the housing crisis. You're now shit out of luck because Rachel Reeves has said no. This is about unblocking the planning system. In other words, giving companies what they need as opposed to what people need. Yep, exactly, 100%, 100%. Unless you're like hugely regulating the kind of houses that they can build, then you're not going to get affordable housing, proper affordable housing. But on top of that, if you don't regulate how they build, you're going to get shitty quality housing, especially if it's the shitty quality housing that's not being sold to speculators and is being sold to residents. Because that's going to be the thing that's going to end up being such poor quality for necessary cyclical consumption, so that the developers can then get future contracts to rebuild it in future, as opposed to state-built council housing, which has lasted for, almost 100 years at this point.
This government have blown it when it comes to home ownership. Home ownership is now falling under a Conservative government, and it is clear that it is only Labour now that can help people fulfil their dreams of owning their homes, because it's only Labour that will get builders building again in a way that we need to build those homes for people.
But there are 1.2 million people on social housing waiting lists right now. Now, if you're not going to spend taxpayers' money on getting houses built, how are the things you're talking about really going to make a difference to that?
Well, if you look at home ownership levels, they were once as high under the last Labour government as
And again, the entire question around social housing waiting lists, people who have nowhere near the deposit in the current housing market to be able to become homeowners as Rachel Reeves is expecting them to. And there's supposed to be a question and discussion around social housing, around renting. Yet the only thing that we've heard as far as rental support, if they're not going to build council houses to be able to force down rents by competing with the private sector, they're also not introducing rent caps either. And they're also doing mortgage relief for landlords. So the fact that just renters have been completely lost at sea, completely ignored with regards to a question specifically about the rental sector, just shows you where Rachel Reeves' priorities are, which is, of course, swing voters. Swing voters who are either new homeowners or potential new homeowners, the aspirational class, right? Poor working people who are having to pay huge amounts in rent at the moment. You can go f*** yourselves, although we're going to make sure your landlord gets extra mortgage relief so that they can profit more. Because, of course, there's no way that they're going to pass on those savings to you as a renter, because, of course, they're already charging the market price as high as they would anyway. They're coming for your paycheck as wages are on the rise. Because they're getting mortgage relief from the government, they're not going to reduce the rent. When has a landlord ever reduced the rent? Any mortgage relief that's given to buy-to-let landlords will certainly just turn into extra profit for landlords, and the renters will see absolutely none of it.
If you're not going to spend taxpayers' money building houses, you've been really clear about that. How on earth can you guarantee to our viewers that there are going to be more homes to rent and more homes to buy?
Because builders want to build, it's just the planning system mitigates against that. The government, of course, got rid of the planning target.
The thing is, builders actually don't want to build. The whole reason why actually one of Labour's good policies is the compulsory purchase order policy, which is specifically compulsory purchase orders for unused and developable land, which investors own the land and they can't be bothered to develop on it because they're just waiting for the land to go up in price to be able to sell the houses that they build for more. The whole point of the compulsory purchase order is to threaten them with compulsory purchase to force them to be able to develop. And Rachel Reeves knows this. It's her policy. We need to make sure that houses are built, are houses for people to live in and not for investors to speculate on.
So local authorities now have no obligation, no targets to build new homes, and as a result those homes aren't getting built. And this has a real economic impact as well. If house building falls in the way that is now expected, that's a £44 billion hit to the UK economy every single year. And many businesses as well say that they struggle to recruit people because people can't afford to live in the places where the jobs are being generated.
But success,
so this is incredibly important.
Everybody knows it's important.
So that builders
Yeah, if you want it to be affordable for people to just move there, have cheap social housing, a slight increase in supply might have a small amount of change in rent. It's going to take a long time for those that to be able to filter in through to the wider market. There's going to have to be pretty heavy competition for landlords to relinquish their current monopoly on the rental market. So unless you cap the rent, or unless you compete with the landlord class through social housing, why are rents ever going to go down? And we are specifically talking about rents here. If a point on this one is, well, no, in which case, well, we have to deregulate the planning system specifically because people can't find anywhere cheap to live where they want to move to for a new job. I'm like, well, okay, you need to make sure rents go down then. That's what you're talking about. You're talking about rents.
And everybody knows it's important, but successive Conservative governments have said, we'll unblock the planning system. That's what we need to do. That's the formula.
Opposite,
except that many experts in this sector think unless you're going to do something much bolder, much bigger, something like perhaps spending taxpayers' money to get things built, it's not going to make that much difference.
And that's not what the house builders are saying. The house builders are not saying that they need government money. What they are saying...
What they are saying is, I can't be bothered building on this land because I'm speculating on the value of it going up. That's it, right? We already know this is happening. Like, don't get me wrong, I think there needs to be some planning reform. I'm not saying that the idea of planning reform in itself is a bad thing. It just depends on who you're reforming the planning for, what you think is going to get built in those areas, and how you get it built and who builds it. That's the issue here. And again, if you were doing planning reform so that you could have the councils have easy access for new land for new council homes, brilliant, perfect, love it. Be super happy with that. But considering the planning reform is just let new developers be able to build willy-nilly whatever it might be, that's not a real solution. Again, because most people just go into the private sector and won't have a dramatically large effect on rents overall.
They want those planning targets back, and they want the planning system unblocked. That is what Labour offers in contrast to the Conservatives.
Labour are the party of planning corporations and of landlords, and the Conservative Party are the party of property speculators. Anyone speaking out for working class people at all? No? Maybe just a tiny bit? Renters perhaps going to come in for this one at all, maybe? The fact that Michael Gove is sounding more progressive on rental reform than Labour are at the moment should tell you something about where the kind of surreal nadir we are with regards to political discourse in this country.
Do you think, can you really tell our viewers that there's very much difference to what you're saying? Because the Conservatives say, we're going to work around the planning system. You're saying you're going to work around the planning system.
The government are not saying that. The government, Rishi Sunak, caved into his backbenchers a few months ago at Christmas last year, 3 days, I think, before Christmas, caved in and said, we'll just end these planning targets. So they are not even trying. They've given up, they've blown it.
But you're confident that tinkering with the planning system is going to make a big difference to putting roofs over people's heads in this country?
And that is what builders are saying to us as well.
This is literally torture, watching her just continually talk as though specifically just developers are the ones who have the needs of the wider population at the bottom of their hearts. They really do indeed care about working people in this country be able to get on, and not indeed their own profit margins or their own speculative investments. Oh my God, it's excruciating.
You unblock the system and we will build the homes, and then young people and families who dream of home ownership will be able to fulfil that dream again. And let me just also say this, you know, there are people who have managed to get on the housing ladder who are now seeing their dreams turn into nightmares because of the Tory.
Well, so she's saying here, we need to build more houses so that families, young people can get on the housing ladder. Yeah, sure. If they on their extortionate mortgage price are able to outbid a property investor or Lloyd's TSB or BlackRock or Vanguard being able to pay directly in cash a higher amount, you're living in fantasyland. They cannot outbid the fact private equity and investment firms are buying up housing with cash specifically, A, to avoid the mortgage rate, and B, because they want to become feudal landlords. Reeves in the remake of Field of Dreams, or literally every single time we have someone from Labour on, and the Conservatives for that matter, they just seem to entirely base their policy on Field of Dreams. We literally have two parties governing by Field of Dreams at this point, right? If you build it, they will come. But the problem is that the they in this case turns out to be private equity firms. Let's
talk about one of the other big areas that I know you really care about. Last time you came on this programme, you said that you'd be spending £28 billion a year on green projects. You said it was crucial and you said it needed urgency. Now, since you came on last, that has now been delayed. Are you 100% committed to reaching that level of spending, £28 billion a year, by the end of the first Parliament if you win the election?
I can't overstate the damage the Conservatives have done to the economy, but I'm not going to apologise for making sure that our sums add up. And since I first announced...
Oh no, it's household budget economics as well. Oh no, this is so embarrassing. You're on the flagship BBC talk show about politics, and your response on would you be fiscally responsible is we need to make sure our sums add up. Do you think we're children?
Interest rates have gone up 13 times. Inflation's now at 8.7%, seems to be stuck there, been there for the last 2 months. And I've always been clear that all our policies, including investing in the industries of the future and boosting our energy security, are subject to our fiscal rules, which means paying for day-to-day spending through tax receipts and getting debt down as a share
So that
of our
explains the
economy.
delay. But my question is, are you committed to spending that £28 billion by the end of your first Parliament if you win the election?
We're confident that we can get there, but all of our
But are you
plans will
committed to
always
it?
be. Yeah, we're committed to it, but it's subject to our fiscal rules. And that's really, really important to say.
The thing is that I've seen clips of this particular interview already on Twitter, and one of the things that she'll say after this is, well, actually, there's a big difference between borrowing to fund day-to-day spending and borrowing for investment, and that's 100% correct. Right, for once, she's correct. She's absolutely correct. The borrowing for investment is indeed different, and that's how you're going to be able to grow the economy, by using state fiscal expansion to be able to invest in your infrastructure. That's what I've been calling for months and months, if not a year at this point, around the kind of the Labour policy platform. Yet she's saying, oh, we have ironclad fiscal rules. One of her fiscal rules is no fiscal expansion until debt is dropping as a proportion of GDP. And I'm like, so you're baking austerity into your fiscal rules. You're going to need the fiscal expansion to be able to increase GDP, to be able to reduce the debt to GDP ratio. Are their fiscal rules ever scrutinised? Of course their fiscal rules are never scrutinised. I mean, obviously you know that. Instead of scrutinising the fiscal rules and the basis of the ideology behind those rules, they're just talking about individual policies and whether or not that these can be optically good or not. Because again, the BBC know this themselves, that their own presenters will view increases in fiscal expansion as being automatically bad optics, when of course we've had the lowest investment in the G20 for the last 13 years. Our entire economy is starved of investment, and because the state has not been investing, how do you fix that? By getting the state to invest. It's not kind of difficult. And this idea that because interest rates are high and gilt yields are on their way up, it means you can't engage in fiscal expansion. That's complete nonsense. Gilt yields are exactly where they were in the late 40s when Clement Attlee and Anya and Bevan were nationalising huge parts of the economy, huge swathes of the economy. Our debt to GDP ratio at the end of the war was almost double what it is now. So this idea that our high levels of debt, our high levels of interest rates comparatively, and an increase in gilt yields compared to the average over the last 10 years, that doesn't mean we therefore cannot engage in fiscal expansion for new government investment.
And those are your limits on spending, that jargon.
Yes, and what I say is that you pay for day-to-day spending through tax receipts and you get debt down as a share of the economy. David Gauke made a really good point on the panel earlier. Debt has tripled under the Conservatives. Debt is now the same size as our whole economy. We've got to get a grip of that, and all of our plans will be consistent with those fiscal rules.
And those fiscal rules, which are the spending limits, so that you only borrow if it's something for a big long-term project and everything else is accounted for day to day, that is very clearly, from what you've just said, at the absolute top of your list.
All of
and
our
other
plans,
things will have to wait.
All of our plans will be built on a rock of economic and fiscal responsibility. Labour will not play fast and loose with the public finances, because the people who pay the price for that are people who own their own homes, who wish to own their own homes, people running small businesses who have been terribly affected by the turbulence in the economy, the increases in mortgage rates, the increases in prices in the shops. We will never put family finances at risk in the way the Conservatives
does mean
have.
by implication that your £28 billion target, which I know you care about very deeply, that could still be vulnerable, that could be ditched if the numbers don't work.
If we look at the numbers in the most recent...
The numbers will always work, based upon what Rachel Reeves has just said about engaging in fiscal expansion for new infrastructure projects, right? Which Laura Kuenssberg has already acknowledged in this very segment, just what she was saying just then. By both of their own acknowledgement right now, that 28 billion can always be used because it is specifically earmarked for new investment. Obviously, it's investment in corporate subsidy for energy. GB Energy should, instead of being a slush fund for investment, it should be its own generator who builds its own government-owned energy generation that it then sells to the national grid to make money for the exchequer. All of it is earmarked for new investment in infrastructure. And given that both of you in this very segment have said that this is fine, we can both engage in infrastructure spending through fiscal expansion, just not for day-to-day spending, then that 28 billion can always be used. There is no situation in which that cannot be used based upon their own admissions of how the economy functions. That's not even what I'm saying, that's what they're saying.
Government forecasts, we can get to that total investment of £28 billion a year. The government, of course, are spending money themselves.
But you're not committing to it.
Well, everything will be subject to the fiscal rules,
okay,
but the numbers that we see
really
currently,
yeah.
the numbers we see currently, I'm confident that we can get there. But the fiscal rules are non-negotiable. I will never play.
The thing is, that's the reason why. Because the fiscal rules are what is constraining this, not any necessary constraint around the way in which you use fiscal expansion. Because again, one of the other fiscal rules, apart from borrowing only being used for infrastructure and new investment projects, whatever it might be, the only other thing on top of that that's constraining it is their desire to only do that when debt is falling as a percentage of GDP, which of course you're going to need to invest to be able to do in the first place. So it's just baking austerity into the New Labour platform.
Fast and loose with the public finances.
What's interesting about this is that the last time we had a government that said fiscal rules, spending limits were at the top of the list, the way they dealt with that was to introduce austerity. And by your analysis, you've written austerity starved the economy of the investment it needs to grow. Austerity failed. But listening to you today, if spending limits, those fiscal rules at the top of your list, by your logic, you might make the same mistake again.
No, this is nothing like what the Conservatives did. It's why, for example, the borrowing to invest is different from borrowing to pay for day-to-day spending. Investing in assets that can grow our economy, it is essential if we want to break out of this doom loop of low growth, high taxes.
But you've just said you'll only do that if you can afford to.
Well,
and,
yeah.
and isn't it the case, and you're very proud, I think, of being disciplined on this, but isn't it the case that that discipline means going into the next election, it's very likely that Labour and the Conservatives will basically be following the same kind of tram lines on spending?
I don't accept that.
It is true. Like, I can't believe Laura Kuenssberg, a BBC journalist no less, is calling out the Uni Party on their Identica platforms. I say Identica, right, okay, there is some idea that we may get some infrastructure investment somewhere, which of course we're not really getting from the Conservatives, at least not in a post-Boris Johnson world, right? Boris Johnson was the only person who was ever going to give us any investment from the state, because Rishi Sunak is far too neoliberal for that shit. Laura Kuenssberg isn't wrong, again, based upon Rachel Reeves' own fiscal rules about when they can engage in the borrowing in the first place. It just shows you the failure of the platform that's being proposed here. Another failure as well, I was having this discussion on Twitter, was that one thing that we also get from Rachel Reeves' rhetoric is they are taking the failure of Liz Truss, which should be the biggest win for the left basically ever, right? This is the biggest economic win for the left since the 40s, where we can look at right-wing tax cut economics, supply-side reform politics, and say, this crashes the economy, this is terrible politics, never do this. And instead of using it as a stick with which to beat supply-side economics, they're using it as a stick to be able to beat the left and beat progressive economics, to beat Keynesianism as an economic strategy by saying, well, actually, look at what Liz Truss did. By borrowing too much, she crashed the economy. And I'm like, there's a difference between borrowing for unfunded tax cuts and borrowing for new investment by growing the productive capacity of the economy. Because that, of course, does increase the supply. That increases the supply of goods and services within the economy, and you can guarantee that it will. Of course, Liz Truss's tax cuts, first of all, they really crashed the economy, not because she engaged in fiscal expansion. They really crashed the economy because it signalled to the markets that the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Prime Minister didn't have a clue what they were doing managing the economy. It's really and truly is the market's confidence in the pound as a currency that really matters, right? That's why the pound was dropping then but isn't dropping now, even though gilt yields are higher than they were during the period following the fiscal event. But as long as markets understand, there's an OBR forecast, the Treasury coming out with decent reports on the effect of new spending on the economy, markets are not going to react in the same way they did to Liz Truss. Again, I will go back to the 1940s, 1950s, where our debt to GDP ratio was way higher than it is right now in the post-war period. Our bond yields were similar to what they are now, and yet we still managed to go huge amounts of state investment, wide-scale nationalisation under Clement Attlee. This is not a radical position that I'm trying to put forward here.
If you look, for example, what we've said around taxation of non-doms, I believe if you make your home in Britain, you should pay your taxes here.
You know
And
that's a
under Labour,
Take that off your bingo card, folks.
marginal issue.
Well, I don't-
Important to
well,
some
no,
people,
Laura,
but
I
you
don't
know
think-
that's a small amount of
Well,
cash in
Laura,
the overall thing.
I don't think £3.5 billion a year is marginal. And we've said that we would use that money to invest in one of the biggest ever workforce expansions in the NHS. You had Steve Barclay on this programme last week. He said that he had an NHS workforce plan, but he had no idea how it was going to be funded. Labour do. We would fund it through that non-dom tax status being revoked. That is a tax loophole that has existed for 200 years. Labour would close it to invest in our public services. That's the difference.
Whoa, Rachel, what about the ending the VAT exemption on private schools? You can't forget the other thing that you keep repeating ad infinitum as if it's going to be the solution to all of your fiscal worries.
Difference between Labour and Conservatives. I explain how our sums add up, and I close loopholes if they don't work for working people and use them for the priorities that we see, the priorities for this country.
And just yes or no, are you disputing then a suggestion, a report in the Sunday Times this morning that basically your spending plans are on the same track as Conservatives? You dispute that?
Well, they're not on the same track. I've just given you one example, but there are others as well. But I am absolutely committed to fiscal...
I mean, they're the same on public sector pay, i.e. looking at the projected, estimated recommendation from the independent pay review bodies that we were told were the reason why that we couldn't meet the union demands, right? We told that the union demands were too high. The inflationary pay was too high, right? Because remember, the union demands weren't just for pay in line with inflation. They were pay restoration down to 2010 purchasing power. So the union's pay demands couldn't be met because we had to go to the independent pay review body. The inflationary pay increase to be able to maintain their current level of real terms pay, that was denied because we had to be able to match what was being recommended by the independent pay review body. And then now they have come out and we think it's going to be between 6 and 6.5%. And both parties are saying we will not increase public sector pay as much as the independent pay review bodies are telling us we should, even though that was the reason given as to why there wouldn't be proper negotiations with the unions with regards to this pay. How different are both of these parties at the end of the day? The real big difference is the £28 billion of green energy investment as far as fiscal policy is concerned. And even that's theoretical on the chopping block because Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules are very, very, very silly.
I have no desire to see the tax burden on working people increase. In fact, I would like the tax burden on working people to be lower, but it all has to be built on that rock of economic and fiscal stability, because if you put that at peril, then you see what's happened in our economy these last few months with sky-high interest rates and inflation that is very difficult to get under control.
And you say you want taxes on working people to be lower. Good, based. I agree 100%. Yeah, we already have you on record in the discussion was in the Times about your conversations with other people that there are no plans on raising capital gains tax, which is the way that rich people make their money. No taxes on dividend payouts, which are another way in which rich people make their money. And there's no plans to raise the top rate of tax to be able to give a tax cut to people who actually do productive work. We are unproductive as a society because we tax people who do productive work too much. It's a disincentive. Why get a real job where you actually make things and be productive in the economy when you can turn money into more money through shifting around assets, by trading stocks, by buying and selling houses or whatever it might be, and you pay less tax? Why would you bother doing something productive? And I agree with Rachel when she says that there should be tax cuts for working people. They should be lower. You're going to have to offset that somewhere in the economy at some point, and it should come from the rich. There's zero plans at all to increase taxes on the rich from the Labour Party. Nothing. Brilliant. Love it.
Election may still be a long time away, a lifetime in political sense, but Labour has been in the polls way ahead for many, many months. And it's interesting, some recent surveys have suggested that you're starting to get the kind of recognition as somebody who is very likely to be the next Chancellor. You've built your argument this morning on being very tough on spending, very strict, but do you think you'll be a radical Chancellor? Is that what you would want to be?
I want to be the Chancellor that grows the economy and gives this country its hope and its future back. I go around the country and I see huge potential. You know,
it's uncanny, like the kind of rhetoric that Rachel Reeves uses is very similar to the kind of stuff that you got from Liz Truss. It's very similar verbiage. What's interesting as well is that when you talk about things like deregulation onto the economy, which she's also mentioned, she wants to be able to become a haven for private sector investment. That's, again, a kind of Trussite policy. Tom Harwood, I've done a video about this before, in his Substack, was praising Rachel Reeves as the new Liz Truss. Just saying, Liz Truss, not a particularly popular politician, doesn't have a great economic track record. Take from that what you will.
Businesses with great ideas, universities with fantastic young people with ideas to start new businesses and grow their businesses, families and young people who are excited about the future. But what we don't have today is a government that matches that scale of ambition. It's why the plans we've set out, including the Green Prosperity Plan, to invest in carbon capture and storage, GB energy, a whole...
Oh, carbon capture's not a thing, Rachel. Oh, no, why? Shut up. Stop. Stop it now. Carbon capture is just a massive boondoggle being used for fossil fuel companies to be able to put their money somewhere that means that there can be an ecologically friendly way of them still engaging in the same polluting business they've already been doing. Carbon capture is a complete nonsense waste of money. So stupid.
Fully publicly owned energy company to invest in energy generation, our modern industrial strategy, our plans to make Britain the best place to start and grow a business. This can transform the UK economy, build in the security that we need for family finances, is anti-inflationary, can help get bills down, and can bring to Britain the jobs of the future. You've got John Kerry on the programme later.
In a couple of minutes, which is why we must wind up this interview.
But in the US, they are seizing these opportunities to grow the economy.
And I
don't want other countries stealing a march on Britain. We've got the idea and the talent here. We've got to harness it.
And quickly, not...
The thing is that the Inflation Reduction Act involved way more kind of radical spending proposals on loads of different sectors of the economy outside of a slush fund to be able to invest in new public-private partnerships for energy generation. That's what we're getting from, like, the Inflation Reduction Act was a really good piece of legislation. We went to all different facets of the economy. They had an infrastructure bill as well to be able to improve the current crumbling infrastructure in America. We're getting none of that. There's no long-term plans outside of the Green Prosperity Plan, which looks like it's being shelved anyway, given the current state of the fiscal rules. So the idea that you can say, well, look at what America are doing, we plan to do much more than that. And I'm like, well, how far-reaching? Where's it going to go? The fact that Joe Biden is looking far more radical as a president than Keir Starmer is as the Labour Party leader, it really is a sad indictment of the state of the Labour Party.
Everybody might know this, but you were a champion chess player as a child. Politics is sometimes talked about as a chess game. So if it is, where do you think you've got the Conservatives? Are you at checkmate yet?
Well, I describe it as we're a rook ahead after about 30 moves, but we're playing an opponent that usually beats us. So this is not in the bag, but we are determined to offer to the country the hope that it needs, but also the reassurance that our sums add up and we can make the change that this country desperately needs.
OK, a rook ahead. I'm going to...
She is, unironically, basically playing 5D chess as far as the FBPE crowd are concerned. The hashtag GTTO crowd on Twitter. No, honestly, right, all of this right-wing rhetoric, all of this neoliberal rhetoric, all of this reactionary rhetoric, that's just horseplay. When they get into power, it'll be a complete sea change in rhetoric and policy, and they'll turn out to actually be very, very progressive. You just wait, naysayers. Sir Keir Starmer, he's really and truly, actually, secretly very, very progressive. No matter how many times you point out that he deported somebody for stealing a scoop of ice cream, I'm not making that shit up, but how many times you point this out, they'll still try and convince you that he's a secret progressive. At least there is plenty of people out there who at least admit that that's their hope, that all they want is the Tories out. They're going to vote for Labour because they have no other options. They're just hoping and praying that the change happens. They don't expect it, but they hope it's going to happen. Which I have far more respect for than this legion of people who are having their wallets continually inspected by these shameless grifters. No, he will turn tail. They'll be so progressive. You naysayers in love with Magic Grandpa, and you hate Starmer because he's not promising you a unicorn. Please understand how politics works, please. If you enjoyed this video, please do consider liking and subscribing. It does help out the channel and the algorithm. And if you click the bell notification icon, it will let you know when I go live and when I upload videos. If you'd like to follow me on social media, my handle is @NoJusticeMTG, and that is Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Twitch, and YouTube. If you want to support my channel in a more financial manner, you can do so by becoming a member for just 99p, by super chatting, or by supporting me on Patreon, with the link is in the description of this video, and hopefully I'll catch you on the next segment.